Welcome to Best of Reddit. Be sure to subscribe as we upload new content daily. Today I have 2 stories of revenge for you, so sit back and relax while I get right into story number 1, titled, The Time I Ruined My High School Teacher's Career and Got Her Fired in the Greatest Way Possible. This story is widely known amongst my family and is constantly brought up and joked upon in my group of friends even years later. A buddy of mine suggested that this is the perfect place to make it public, so let's get into this crap storm. Backstory: I was a senior in high school at the time and I had never been the brightest student. I was a solid C student and I had never received a detention or had any kind of bad student record. This is important because to this day, I still have no idea why the teacher treated me this way. The teacher, who we will name Mrs. Frank, had been a teacher there for more than a decade and was widely known for being a petty, heartless witch who the administrators saw as the golden child. Mrs. Frank taught algebra, which is my worst subject, so naturally I had issues understanding the lessons and would ask questions frequently. To some these questions are easily answered, but to me it was rocket science. Usually when someone asks a dumb question, no one should address it. However, in Mrs. Frank's case, she would belittle me in front of everyone by saying things such as, "And here comes the slow boy again, wow, surprise surprise, you don't understand it again, really. We have to go extra slow for you today, don't we, etc. etc." I tried going to the administration about it before, but again she was considered the golden child. They would send someone in to examine her during class, she would act respectful and normal for one day, and go back to being a witch the next. This goes on for about half the year until I had enough. I went to the local Radio Shack, bought a recorder, and secretly recorded every insult she would throw at me. I would sometimes instigate to make up for the lost time. Go ahead, feed the fire. Fast forward to the end of the year and I'm sitting in Mrs. Frank's class when I ask a question. Her response, and I quote because it's burned into my brain, was, "I've been teaching here for over 10 years and that was the single dumbest question I've ever heard come from anyone's mouth." She continued the lesson without answering. I calmly stood up, packed up my stuff, and headed to the nurse's office to dismiss myself from school. We were allowed to dismiss ourselves if we were 18. I went home, compiled all of the brutal tapes into one glorious masterpiece, and headed back the next day to show the administrators. I sat down with the principal and we listened to a couple of the insults before he stopped me. He wanted more witnesses present as well as Mrs. Frank's. He told me we would meet the next day where I could show him and the rest of the administrators the full tape. I walk into school the next morning being the most nervous I've ever been for anything. I was called down to the office where I met with some board directors, the local school police officer, the principal, the vice principal and Mrs. Franks. What follows was some of the greatest minutes of my life. I watched as the administrators went from fed up with being in another useless meeting, to furious and speechless, with some of them keeping their mouths open for the duration of the tape. I also watched Mrs. Frank go from confident and stuck up, to her realizing that she had screwed up beyond repair. She was publicly roasting herself in front of the most important people from the district. The tape ended and without hesitation, the administrators looked around in astonishment and the principal turns to me and says, "I think we have heard everything we need to, thank you." And I was quietly dismissed from the room. The final time I saw Mrs. Frank was leaving the room. I looked back and we made eye contact through her tear-filled eyes as I gave the biggest, most evil smile. I returned to class the next week and Mrs. Frank was nowhere to be found. The story spread quickly throughout the school and I was seen as a saint. I had successfully gotten her fired and made it almost impossible for Mrs. Frank to return to her teaching career, as well as cut off most of her connections she had with other teachers in the school. I had ruined her financially because no school district in the area would hire this walking piece of garbage. If you're reading this, Mrs. Frank, I'd like to take this moment to tell you to go screw yourself. And now without hesitation let's get straight into revenge story number 2, titled, Maintenance Guy Throws Out 15 Years of Important Knowledge. A while ago I worked at a baseball store called Ball Mart, or a general goods store that sounded like that, not so long after the Great Recession of 2008, and management was trying to cut costs because of falling profit. One of the first things management did was fire 2 of the 3 full-time maintenance cleaning guys. The one guy they kept, I'll call him MG for maintenance guy, was amazing at his job. Everything in the store ran well because of him and his willingness to go beyond what was required to help people. A genuinely nice guy. For 6 months management tried to make having 1/3 of a maintenance staff work, and it failed miserably. MG could not do everything, and over time, management increasingly asked him to coordinate some part-timers that were supposed to do the cleaning and carts. He spent so much time coordinating that he had no time for maintenance. The night crew was also cut, so they couldn't pick up the slack. Then 2 things happened within the space of a week that told management how important he was to the store running well. First, some cleaning machines broke down. Turns out they have to be properly cleaned weekly. If left alone they gum up real bad and parts wear out quickly. A several $1,000 repair bill because he was told to prioritize coordinating part-timers over tinkering with machines. A few days later the deli lady nearly quit after the blade on the deli slicer went flying off and could have cut her face badly. Turns out that the bolt that held it in place was loose, and MG had tightened it weekly for her. When he didn't have time to do that anymore he told management it had to be replaced for safety. Well, management didn't do that because it cost money, but they told people it was fixed. That could have been a lawsuit or criminal charges. They and deli lady got lucky. So management sat down with him and asked him why things were going wrong. MG told them point blank he needed enough time for maintenance, and someone else had to coordinate the part-time cleaners and check up on them. They were rather lazy. Management called BS. They said maintenance should be easy and done quickly. MG got mad because that insulted his professionalism and he pulled out his notebook from his back pocket. It turns out that over his 15 years he had filled the book with charts, schedules, and diagrams of how to do his job and keep things running. There were over 100 things he checked weekly or monthly. There were a lot of machines he kept in running order, some had certain things that were half broken and had to be wiggled in a certain way, etc. To be honest, a lot of these things were minor or major safety hazards, but over the years management was fine with not replacing multi-$1,000 machines if MG knew how to keep them working. As well, he did things that he should not have done, like calibrating machines for departments that should have done it themselves or contracted it out, etc., but he was a nice guy and he liked helping people. He told me that he spent about a half hour telling management about what he did, and he suspected that until then nobody had ever known how much he did. Well, he may have said a few swear words and derogatory things while telling management why he needed time to do stuff. It was not a good moment for him and he was peeved. At the end he put his notebook back in his pocket and offered to take a week to write up everything he knew so that management would have written proof of why his job mattered in case a higher-up asked why they increased maintenance costs when corporate was demanding they cut costs. The multiple managers in the room looked at each other, and asked him to leave so they could talk in private. He told me, several years later, when I ran into him somewhere and had lunch with him, that he had a premonition as he walked out of the room, so he went to the back room and tossed his notebook in the garbage compactor. For good measure he then went around the store and emptied all the garbage cans and tossed those bags in so his notebook was properly buried. He was fine with it, all that information was in his head. After a few minutes later management called him back. They told him that they could not allow him to keep working there because of the level of insubordination he had showed. They said as soon as he surrendered his badge, box cutter, and notebook he would be escorted out of the building by security. They basically treated him like a criminal. Most fired people are not escorted out unless they were suspected of committing a crime that could not be proved. He handed over his badge and box cutter. They asked for the notebook. He said he threw it in the compactor. Their eyes went wide and they asked why he threw it out. He said he thought he was going to write everything up nicely on the computer from memory, so he thought he was done with the notebook. At this point management starts looking at each other worried, because they had intended to take his book, fire him, and have a less subordinate part-timer, who doesn't get expensive benefits like a full-timer, do his job. Now they couldn't. One of the managers suggested that he be allowed to write up the info before being escorted out. The others agreed. He was given the chance to be unfired just long enough to give them the info. How kind. He laughed and walked out, head held high, and management followed him to his car to make sure he left. I don't have exact numbers, but I guesstimate the store had to spend at least $20,000 or $30,000 to replace stuff that MG had kept working beyond the equipment's lifespan, and the new guy they hired had a hell of a time figuring out how things worked. To be honest, in a few cases MG had gone too far, like creating fire hazards by taping broken chargers together after rewiring them instead of tossing them, but management had never complained when he saved them money. There was also a lot of things that should have been done by the health and safety team or the departments, but they also never complained about having less work. I asked him if throwing out that notebook was illegal, but he said it was personal property to help him remember things, it was not a work-provided notebook. He was proud of what he did, his pride clearly showed in how he told the story. He said that nobody is allowed to question his professional judgment by implying he is lazy. I agree. If you enjoyed one or both of these stories, please remember to hit that subscribe button before proceeding to the next video. Thank you.